Eu tive o prazer de entrevistar Howard Scott Warshaw, que foi o criador do jogo ET para o Atari 2600, que levou a fama de ser o pior jogo do mundo e o principal responsável pela indústria dos videogames praticamente ter quebrado nos Estados Unidos em 1983, um evento que ficou conhecido como Crash de 1983. O Howard escreveu um livro recentemente que ele fala dessa história, e o título do livro fala que como ele quase conseguiu destruir uma indústria. No vídeo que vocês vão ver hoje, na entrevista, eu vou abordar vários assuntos interessantes. Ele vai falar bastante do ET, o que ele poderia ter feito se ele tivesse mais tempo. O ET foi um jogo que foi desenvolvido em 5 semanas. O que ele poderia ter feito de diferente se ele tivesse tido mais tempo e quais foram os fatores reais que causaram a quebra da indústria de videogames nos Estados Unidos. Foi ele o grande responsável? Foi o ET o jogo que de fato fez tudo isso? O vídeo tá imperdível, tenho certeza que vocês vão gostar muito, beleza? Peguem a pipoca de vocês, que a entrevista vai começar. Wow, what a moment for me today and for my channel. Usually I'm calm when I'm interviewing guests, but I'm feeling butterflies in my belly for this one because this is really special. Today I have the pleasure of talking to a true video game legend, Howard Scott Warshaw, a former game engineer who created 3 of the most iconic games ever made. Yars' Revenge, this one here. The Raiders, what is it? Here. The Raiders of the Lost Ark. And the infamous E.T. for the Atari 2600. Hi, Howard, thank you so much for accepting my invitation for this interview and welcome to the Retro Gamer Brazil channel.
Luis, it's a pleasure to be here. Mucho gusto and obrigado.
Oh, de nada. Yeah, I'm glad that you are practicing your Portuguese. That's nice.
So it means a lot to be here. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. Appreciate that. And I'm sure that my audience will appreciate it a lot. And I know that you have some news to share. So that the final part of the video, I will give you also space to share the good news for the Latin America audience as a whole, not only Brazil. So this interview is happening and is being recorded in April 2023. And this year is the 40th anniversary of the famous video game crash of 1983. So for folks that don't know, in 1983, the video game industry almost collapsed in the United States due to many reasons that we will discuss in this video here, in this interview. And the E.T. game, I think the E.T. game, he carries the world on his shoulder because it's often blamed as the main responsible for the crash. And many people say that it is the worst game ever made, which I strongly disagree. So Howard, my first question to you, and maybe a too broad question, but I'm sure that we can explore, elaborate on this. Let's pretend that this video is for an audience that knows nothing about the video game crash, no positive or negative feelings about it. How would you tell the real story about what happened in 1983?
The real story, you mean the reason why it happened or just the phenomenon of it happening? Because those are...
Yeah, I think both, but the reason why it happened, I think that's the main one, and then we can keep talking. Yeah.
So I think it's important to understand that now video games are everywhere. Everyone understands what video games are. We grow up with video games. It's a natural part of our life.
Yeah.
It's important to understand that back in the late 70s, video games did not exist. They were just beginning.
Yeah.
And what happened is in a very short period of time, video games went from nothing, because nobody knew what it was, nobody heard of it, to everywhere, all over the world. It was seen everywhere. And then sometime between 1983 and 1984, there was a collapse that suddenly this thing that was everywhere was nowhere. It just disappeared. There's that big question, how could something so huge, so amazing, so worldwide disappear like that? It didn't make any sense. And it caused a lot of people to question what were video games about? Were they just a flash in the pan? Was it just a fad? Or you know, people couldn't understand it. A lot of people lost fortunes. Fortunes changed. A lot of things really shifted at that time. So people started to look for reasons. You know, why? Why would this happen? How is it that that something that's so huge could suddenly become so small and disappear?
Yeah.
And what they decided was that the E.T. video game was the reason that everything died and fell apart, and that was the source of the crash. Because as you know, in media, when you're going to tell a big story, it's always important to tell it through the eyes of something very specific. There needs to be a pair of eyes. There needs to be one identifiable source that we can relate to and work through and understand. And so there needed to be a face of the video game crash. And I think what happened was that E.T. became the face of the video game crash, and I became the butt behind that face. So that's what a lot of people said was the reason. I wrote a book recently called Once Upon Atari, and in this book, I go into, thank you. In this book, I go into all the reasons, what I feel are the real reasons, because in my background, I was a video game engineer. I have a master's degree in computer engineering, but I also have degrees in economics, in counseling psychology, and theater. And I felt that this gave me a really good background to be able to understand and analyze what really happened behind the scene.
Yeah.
And the real reasons for the crash were not the E.T. game, right? It's absurd to think that one video game destroyed the entire industry. It's just not true. It's not even financially possible.
Yeah.
But what did cause this crash was a combination of cultural factors, corporate culture, and the fact that this was the first product life cycle in video games. There were some video game systems before the Atari system, but the Atari system was the first one that went into the tens of millions and was distributed everywhere and created the incredible penetration that it did. And so, since this was the first time a video game became huge, no one really understood what that product life cycle looks like. So they made mistakes, they made misestimations, they made poor approximations, and they made some just plain bad decisions. And as a result of that, they created a complex set of circumstances that was just right to take a $4 billion industry and destroy it in about a year and a half.
Yeah.
Which really is an amazing accomplishment if you think about it. And so, but people don't like complex explanations, right? People like simple, pure explanations. So the real explanation is it was the first product life cycle, and corporate cultural shifts came about that turned everything upside down. But that's still too complex, and it's hard for a lot of people to understand. So the idea that this one video game destroyed the industry, that's very easy to understand. Yeah. And that's what became the folklore. That became the handy explanation. So E.T. became the face of the video game crash, and therefore it became the worst video game of all time.
Yeah, yeah. What I hate this definition. I was telling to a friend the other day that for me, E.T., I do a parallel with wine. I think the older it gets, the better it gets. I enjoy playing E.T. today much more than when I was a kid. Maybe when I was a kid, and in Brazil many times we didn't have the manuals, so we needed to find out how to play the game like by instinct. But today, after like reading the manual and understanding and thinking as an adult, I love playing E.T. So.
Oh, that's fantastic. I appreciate it. You know, and I appreciate what you're saying, but I also have to say that I really don't hate the idea that it's the worst game of all time. In fact, I actually like the idea. Now, to be clear, I don't believe E.T. is the worst video game of all time. I really don't. There are far worse games than E.T.
Oh, yeah.
But E.T. was the fastest video game ever done for the VCS. Yeah. But I like it when people call it the worst game of all time. For one simple reason. As you know, I also did Yar's Revenge. Yeah. And Yar's Revenge is frequently named as one of the best video games of all time. So as long as E.T. is the worst game of all time, And I have the greatest range of any game designer in history. And I'm very proud to have that title.
I love it. Yeah, I love it. And that triggers my next question to you, because when I first saw your book, because first you released a documentary, right, with the same name, the Once Upon Atari.
I did, Once Upon Atari.
Yeah, and next, like more recently, you released the book, How I Made History by Killing an Industry. So my question was, okay, how much irony there is here? What is behind this phrase that you add to the title?
That's an excellent question. Okay, yeah, I specifically titled the book Once Upon Atari, How I Made History by Killing an Industry, because I think it sounds cool. That's what everybody says is the truth. Yeah. But the title, and people keep writing to me and say, I don't really think you destroyed the industry. And I agree with that. And I point out to them that the title is ironic. That was the point of it, because I love irony. There's even a section in the book that's all about the ironies of the ET project and Atari in general, because there are a lot of ironies. I'll tell you one great irony of the ET game, though. One of my favorite ironies of the whole thing is that one thing that people forget about it was extremely unusual at the time, but ET is actually an entirely non-violent game, which was very unusual at the time. And what's really interesting is that a totally non-violent game killed $1 billion industry. That to me is a great irony, but the title is ironic because I explain why it wasn't really the ET game, but I do go into the actual factors, what went on, as well as all the shenanigans and all the crazy goings on that went on at Atari, because Atari was a just insane place to work, an amazingly creative and wild environment to be in. And it was vibrant, and it was exciting, and it was scary, and it was dangerous at times, but it was one of the most amazing experiences of my entire life. And I've lived a pretty remarkable life.
Yeah, and that's another curiosity that I have, because let's say general knowledge is that Atari had the Nolan Bushnell time and then the post-Nolan Bushnell time, like when Warner took control and Ray Kazzai also took control. Do you think, like from a cultural standpoint, the company changed much, or this creativity, like this irreverence that you mentioned, was still there?
It changed enormously. And one of the big changes was they were trying to put more of a cap on the creativity and make it more of a marketing-driven company, because I don't think they really understood it. One of the problems that went on with the video game crash was that you had this was a brand new thing, the idea of entertainment technology, right? Atari was one of the first successful companies in the field of entertainment technology, in the field of interactive entertainment. It was new. And so who are you going to get to run a company like that? Companies like that didn't exist before. So what happened was Nolan was someone who started it and understood the environment, and he supported and really promoted the creativity. Then when Warner took over, they instilled they put other people in charge who did not understand technology, who did not understand entertainment. And so they understood how to run a standard company.
Yeah.
But this was not a standard industry. So they really weren't equipped to really understand how to run this successfully, but it didn't stop them from thinking they knew how to run this company and the industry. And so they ran it into the ground.
Yeah, when I reflect about the reasons that the crash happened, I think that like Warner taking control of Atari and killing this DNA was one of the main reasons, because the other companies that were there, like also running the video game business, Mattel or Coleco, they didn't have the video game DNA. Like Mattel was a toy company, Coleco was a leather company. So Atari was the only one that was like authentic, and Warner somehow killed this authenticity.
Right. I really like the way you put it. It is about DNA. Atari did have the DNA for exactly this kind of product, and there were no other established companies that had that. And it wasn't until Atari employees started to get pushed out by the Warner management that DNA started to spread to other places, and that empowered them to turn around and compete with Atari, which was another thing that contributed to the downfall and the crash.
Going back to the ET, because this is also a question that I need to ask you. So I know that you had 5 weeks to develop ET.
Correct. 5 weeks and 1 day.
And what was the normal time or the ideal time to develop a game?
The normal time would have been 6 to 8 months.
6 to 8 months. So let's say that you had the 6 to 8 months to develop ET. What would you have done differently?
Oh, that's a really good question. I actually devoted a section of my book, my Once Upon Atari book, to exactly how I would do the game differently. And what I did was I broke it up into several different categories. Because if I'm going to have more time to do the game, the question is how much more time?
Yeah.
So the first thing is, I said was, well, what if I had one more day? If I had just one more day to work on it, I could have made changes that would have eliminated what were, I think, the major complaints, the biggest complaints about the game. And one of the biggest complaints, and there were problems with ET. I'm never going to tell anyone it's a perfect game, I promise you. And one of the biggest problems with the ET game is that it commits what I consider to be the fundamental sin in video games. And that is that it's okay to frustrate a player. In fact, it's necessary to frustrate a player in a video game, but it is never okay to disorient a player in a video game. In other words, there's a difference between frustration and disorientation, right? Frustration is I can see the cookie jar, but I can't reach it.
Yeah.
That's frustration. Disorientation is like when I step into the kitchen to get a cookie, I suddenly wind up in the garage and I don't know how that happened, right? That's disorientation. And there's too many places in the game for a new player where they wind up in a situation, they have no idea how they got there and it doesn't make any sense. And they're disoriented, and that's not frustration. And that can make a player just want to give up a game. And some people did. So it does commit that sin. And the way it does it is in the transitions into the pits. When people fall into the pits, the way that can happen is apparently counterintuitive. The problem, I do go into it in depth, the problems, there's some interesting problems that went on with ET, not just about the short schedule, but they're mostly about the short schedule. So I would change that. I would fix it so the way you fall into the pits is a little more intuitive, and then that would remove a lot of the issues. Then there's the question of what if I had like an extra week or two? If I had some real time, I would do several other things. I would smooth out some of the play transitions. One thing I would definitely have done is I would have had the first home game with on-screen instructions, because I would actually put in things like, find phone piece.
Yeah.
And, call ship, and then, get to landing zone. I would have the instructions along the way so you'd know what to do, because people don't intuitively know what to do in the game. There's an old rule in Atari that Nolan Bushnell himself came up with. In fact, it's called Bushnell's rule. And that rule is that a video game should be easy to learn and tough to master. A lot of people have probably heard that. And it's a brilliant rule. It's a great rule for coin-op games, right? Which is where Nolan started making coin-op games, right? Because a coin-op game has to let you come in and welcome you into the game very easily, but it has to make it very difficult for you to beat the game, so you'll keep feeding quarters in. So another way he put it is it needs to pay off the first quarter and the 100th quarter. So, but home games don't have that problem. When a person buys a home game, they pay all their quarters up front, and that's it. So my feeling is it doesn't have to be easy to learn, tough to master. My feeling is you could make it a little tougher to learn and tough to master. And if you can make a game, if you can afford to make it a little tougher to learn, you can make a much deeper game. If I can demand a little bit more of a player in terms of learning the game, I can offer them a much bigger game experience. And that's where I went. So we put things in the manual, but you'd have to read the manual, which a lot of people are not used to doing. Mm-hmm. And so that was a challenge. It's also when I don't have much time, the idea of simplifying a game to make it easy to play that takes time, right? That's design time. That's rumination time. There's things in the development of a video game that you don't come up with right away, right? Eventually you figure them out, but you need the time for the game to evolve. And the big problem with the ET game was the fact that there was no time. I only had time to just get something done. I didn't have time to tune it or refine it. So I would have done some things that really refined it and cleaned it up. And then there's the question like you asked, okay, well, what if I had a full, 6 months to do that game? Then I would totally redesign the game. I would do a very different game, because this game wasn't designed to be just a wonderful game. This game was designed to be a game that I could possibly conceivably do in 5 weeks, because that's all I had. So I took it on as a design challenge, not a programming challenge. And I tried to just make a game I could accomplish and just see how good I could make them.
Yeah, I think something that also you mentioned in your book, and I think this is also super easy for people to understand. In the beginning of Atari, in the Nolan Bushnell era, the process was much more like, I have the idea, it's innovation driven, it's creativity, then you make the game, and then it became a commercial thing. And ET was the reverse, right? Well, it came from a commercial need. We need to have something, a blockbuster for the Christmas to surf the wave of the movie. And then the whole process went backwards, right? Is correct to say that?
You are exactly right. And that is really, I'm really glad that you got that you picked that up, because that's one of the most important pieces about the whole puzzle of the crash, right? Is that there was this transition. And that's what I mean by the cultural transition. And you're right. If in the beginning, there was a culture of just make something cool, make something creative. It takes as long as it takes. And when we agree we have something cool, something enjoyable, then we put it out and marketing takes it over and puts it out there. And the transition, what happened was it got to the point where marketing would say, we just need something to stick in this slot at this time because we have this license. We have a commercial property. We just need something to stick in there. We don't care how good a game is. They stopped testing video games. They used to do consumer testing with video games. In fact, Yar's Revenge, I think, was the last game that was consumer tested. And it went through all kinds of testing. That's a whole nother story. Right? But what happened was it got to the point where they didn't need to test games because they didn't care. Because the game had to be released at a certain time, whatever the state of the game was, and that's what they did. So why bother to test it if you know you're just going to put it out anyway? And as the quality dropped, the consumer frustration with the product increased. And that's another factor that created the crash, right? Is suddenly people couldn't count on the fact that if they bought a game, it was going to be a good game. They didn't know if it was a good game. And there was no internet. So there was no way to really check quick feedback on the games. It was going to be weeks or months before you could really get some feedback on a game.
Mm. And another question on this, I think today it's common that the game is just one piece of the whole puzzle. You have an extended universe. You have the game, you have a lot of merchandisers, you have the cartoon, you have the movie. And Yar's Revenge, for me, is really cool because it came with this comic book. So was that an intent to create this extended universe?
It was. I mean, I go, obviously in the book, I tell the whole story behind Yar's Revenge and everything that went on. And Yar's Revenge was very important to me because it was my first game and I wanted to really make a splash. So I named the game. And then in the process of naming the game, I thought, what can I do to make this stronger? And I decided it would be better to write a story. So I actually wrote a backstory. And I didn't even think about it at the time, but this was the first backstory in the history of video games. But I just did it to make my name, the name I chose for the game, more attractive to marketing. When they read the story, they decided to make a comic book and have an ancillary product, right? Have an extra thing that goes out. And so that comic book got created and packed out with the game. And it was the first time that had happened with the video game. Yar's Revenge set a lot of firsts. There were a lot of things I did in Yar's Revenge that no one had ever seen before in video games that became standards in the industry a lot. And so I invented the backstory for video games.
Yeah, that's so cool. And it's an amazing game. Like for the newer generation that is watching this game, please play Yar's Revenge because it's a fantastic game. And there is also a nice story about the name Yar, right? Can Can you tell us?
Absolutely. I tell you, basically, when it came time to name the game, marketing would come up with these proposals, and I just felt they weren't that good. They were kind of lame. And I wanted my game to be special in every way. So I decided I'm going to make up a name. So I asked the marketing representative, I said, hey, can I make a submission for the name? And he goes, yeah, but you better hurry because we're going to decide soon. So I just said to him, this was like one afternoon. I said, come back tomorrow morning. I'll have something for you. So that night I just stayed up, kept thinking and thinking. I was in my office working away. And I thought, okay, I want to make up something. So I decided revenge is a great name because everybody wants revenge, right? Revenge, you can always count on that. So revenge is good, but if it's revenge, then you got to figure out whose revenge is it. And I tried to make up a name for the character because I thought this is a great opportunity. I could make up a name and maybe that'll be a new word. But I couldn't think of any. Everything sounded stupid. And then I thought, instead of just trying to make something up out of thin air, I should come up with an algorithm. I mean, I'm a programmer. I'll use an algorithm to figure out how to name the things. So what I decided to do was pick some name that had very significance to see if I could make a cipher or some kind of change on the name. And then I thought, well, at Atari, the big name was Ray Kazar. He was the CEO of the company. So I thought, okay, well, Ray. Well, I noticed if you spell Ray backwards, that's Yar. And I thought, Yar sounds great. It has a good sci-fi feel to it. And Kazar, his last name, if you spell that backwards, that's Razak. And I thought, well, that sounds kind of cool too. So I decided to name it The Yar's Revenge of Razak 4. It was in the Razak solar system, and Yar would be the character. And that's how the name Yar's Revenge came to be. Now, there's an additional story of how I zoomed marketing and how I out-marketed marketing with it. I don't know, do you want to hear that one?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yes, please.
Okay, so now the marketing rep comes back the next day, and I give him the package. I give him the name, and I wrote that whole story that night to back up the name, to make it stronger. I had someone type it up in the morning, and I handed this whole thing over to the marketing rep. And he ran back and he submitted the name, and that was it. And then he came by later that day. And so I thought, this is my plan. I've got an idea. So I called him over and I said, hey, is the name in? And he goes, yeah. And I said, look, I don't want to unduly influence the naming process. So I want to tell you a secret. I said, but you have to promise not to tell anyone. And he goes, okay, I won't tell. And then I said to him, okay, so, Yar's Revenge? He goes, yeah. I said, what's that spelled backwards? And he thinks for a second, he goes, Ray. And I said, right. And I said, in Razak, the Razak solar system. I said, what's that spelled backwards? And he thinks of it, he goes, Kazar. He goes, oh my God, Ray Kazar? Ray Kazar? I go, yeah. He goes, does Ray know about this? I said, of course Ray knows about this. I said, I wouldn't do something like this without Ray's knowledge. And he goes, okay. I said, but you have to understand, you can't tell anybody because, I don't want this to have an unfair advantage. I just wanted to let you know. And he goes, okay, I won't tell anybody. So I swear him to secrecy 2 more times. And then he takes off. And at this point, I know 3 things, right? First of all, I know he is going to run right back and tell everyone in marketing exactly this is what's going on. I also know that none of them have, the balls basically to go, the cojones, to go talk to Ray and ask him about it. And that's really good because the third thing I know is that Ray knows nothing about it. I totally made all this up. And so he takes off and that's it. And then a day or 2 later, he comes back and he says, guess what? He goes, we're going with Yar's Revenge. And I said, that's great. That's fantastic. And it wasn't until about 4 months later, when I was doing a demo around Christmas time, that I actually saw Ray Kazar. It was the first time I actually talked with Ray Kazar. And Ray comes up to me, goes, I heard what you did with that name with Yar's Revenge. I said, yeah, what did you think about that, Ray? He goes, well, you just keep making games, Howard. But it was a funny moment, but that was how I named the game and then had to do my own little marketing campaign with marketing to get it through.
Yeah, I'm glad it worked because despite being a great game, the history behind it is even greater. Yeah.
I think it's really true. Yar's Revenge is a great game, but it's a much better story.
Yeah.
All the stories, all the things around Yar's Revenge and how it came to be and where it went. And It really was an amazing experience. And then it finally was released. And I got to experience what we call the ultimate Atari high.
Yeah.
Right. Which was, I got to go into a store and not just see my game up on the shelf, but I got to see it was on the demo system. And I got to see two teenagers fighting over the controller to see who gets to play it. And that was an amazing moment for me. I was just like, oh God, I can't, it's an unbelievable feeling. So satisfying, so exciting. I'll never forget that moment. It was one of the greatest days of my life.
Oh, I can imagine. I think it's the highest level of proudness, right? Like feeling really proud about what you did. And let's just go back to the crash of 1983, but now fast forwarding to 2014 in the excavation in the Alamogordo in New Mexico, where like they found 1,300, I think, units of or cartridges of the ET game buried there, confirming that the urban legend was true. You were there, right?
I absolutely was there. In fact, there's a movie called Atari Game Over that tells the whole story of this. But the big dig that they did in Alamogordo, New Mexico, it was both true and false, as like most legends are. Right. I don't think I'm going to spoil anything here for anyone, but the truth is the legend was that the ET game was so bad that they took millions and millions of leftover ET cartridges and took them out to the desert and buried them all and cemented them over to hide them because of their shame. There was so much shame around the game. And that was the thing. And so when we did the dig to see if this urban legend was true, and they did find some ET games. They found, like you say, like 1,300 or 1,500 of them. But they also found all kinds of games. They found Yar's Revenge. They found Defender. They found Centipede. They found a lot of games. Because it wasn't that they got rid of all the ET games. The truth of it was they had just emptied a warehouse because they needed the space to do something else. So it was all kinds. It was game systems. It was controllers. All of that stuff was there, but there were some ET games there. So the legend was true in that there were ET games buried there, but the idea that it was only ET and they just went to bury millions was not true. They had just cleared out a warehouse. And you know that's true because it's so easy to pick up an ET video game because they're all over the place because they didn't bury them all.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not so hard. I have here 2 copies of ET. This one is still sealed. So it's something that I keep with, let's say, is one of the most important items of my collection. And I have this one that is the ET that was released in Japan.
Oh, it's the Japan version.
Atari 2800. So this also is another copy.
Yeah, we can also learn something about international trade values and stuff, right? Because there's inflation. Because in America, it was the 2600. But in Japan, you notice it was the 2800. So they got an extra 200. You know, if you look on the box, it says the Atari 2800.
And that's a perfect segue to my next question. So you were living the Atari world, the Atari culture, like being inside everything that was happening there. In Japan, as we're talking about Japan, in 1983, Nintendo and Sega, they came with the 3rd generation. Like Nintendo launched the Famicom, Sega the SG-1000. But why do you think that the video games company in the US, why did they kept the 2nd generation? Why Atari was not working in a project such as the Famicom, just as an example?
That is a really important question and a very astute one. So, see, here's remember I said that it's the first product life cycle?
Yeah.
So what that means is nobody really knows what to do. Okay. So Sega and Nintendo, those were like the first systems that they entered the market with, right? They started, hey, let's make a new video game system. And that's where they started. But with Atari, they already had made the first really successful system. When you have a system that's working and selling and doing really well, the idea of starting a next generation system kind of feels like you're competing with yourself. Yeah. If we put out a new system now, aren't we stealing sales away from the system that's already out and really doing well. So nobody really understood how long a product life cycle is, and they definitely did not understand how long it takes to make the next system, right?
Yeah.
So you put those two things together and you have one of Atari's biggest blind spots, okay? Because hand over fist, they're trying to collect all the money. They're milking the cash cow, as they say, right? And they're loving it because all this money is just falling all over them. They have no idea what goes into making a game or what goes into making a game system. They don't care. They're just making a lot of money, and that's their job in management. And the idea of doing something else in engineering, we kept saying, hey, let's make a next generation system. Let's do something better because we're going to have to make the next step up. Management was not interested in that because, like I said, they felt it was like competing with themselves. But now you look at it, when the PS4 goes out, they're already starting to design the PS5 because they know it's going to take years to do that, and that's going to be the product life of the PS4 essentially. So they know the timing. They've had a chance, in later generations to see how it goes. But when you're the first one, you don't know. You just don't know how it goes. So there was this battle between engineering saying, hey, new system, new system, new system, and management saying, no, we're making too much money to do something else at this point. That's a ridiculous idea. Look, we'll do that later. We'll do it later. We'll do it later. We kept saying. Then when things started to fall off, because nobody knew how long that was going to take, when things really started to fall off, they fell off quickly. And then Atari snapped into indecision, I like to say, right? Yeah. Where they jumped in and had no idea what to do. Because now they know they do need something new, and where are you going to get it? So it was too late to actually design a new system. So what they did was they took the home computer, which they already had, which was a better game system than the VCS. It was not truly a next generation system, but it was better. And they repackaged that as the 5200. That's what the 5200 was, not a new game system. The 5200 was the home computer that already existed, stuck in a new box and then put out as a game system. And it was an improvement over the 2600, but it was not the kind of step up that things like the Sega systems and the Nintendo systems turned out to be. So, and it didn't really go much of anywhere. And that got kind of sucked into the vortex of the crash because it was too little too late, falling into the pit that was being, the horrible monster that was sucking up the entire industry and just swallowing it whole. And that got pulled in also. So that's really what happened, was they didn't know when to do it. And I don't completely blame them because they didn't understand the tech, and nobody wants to kill the golden goose. You never want to stop your money stream if you have one. So that's what they did. They lacked knowledge and they were a little short-sighted, and then they got caught in too quick a transition that they weren't really ready or prepared for.
Yeah, I have a feeling, and I may be completely wrong, but I feel that if Nolan was still leading the company, or at least if he have led the company for longer, maybe Atari would have gone to the next step, because it was all about innovation mindset, right? I don't know, because he left the company in 76, right? If I'm not wrong.
I think it was closer to 78.
78. So from 72 to 78, only 6 years. So let's say if you have stayed there for 10 years, was more time to really make the culture more intrinsic to the company.
Right. Okay. So it's hard to say hypothetically what would have happened, but I can tell you this, is that you are thinking exactly like everyone in Atari engineering at the time thought. Everybody, I think we all agreed with you, is that if Nolan would have stayed for longer, there would have been more of a technical focus. There would have been a next generation machine that would have been a real next generation machine. And we would have moved forward, and Atari probably would have done much better than they did.
Yeah. Well, so I may be not too too wrong. So I'm happy that
No,
the
I
most
think
important people had the same idea that I have.
Well, it just what it says to me is that you're thinking like an informed and knowledgeable game maker.
And I love innovation. So for me, I'm passionate about this chapter of Atari. So we have 8 minutes left. My last question is kind of a philosophical question and may take more than 8 minutes, but please stop anytime. One of the first video that I made for my channel was comparing Atari with Nintendo and asking which company was more important for video game history and trying to bring a new perspective. So what I did the exercise to project what would be the video game history without Atari, and I did the same exercise without Nintendo. And my conclusion was that Atari was more important, not bigger, not better, but more important. Because in the late 70s and early 80s, there was no other video game company with the power to create everything that Atari created from scratch, as you said. So I don't see Mattel, Magnavox as pioneer and innovative as Atari was. So Nintendo is clear. Nintendo saved the video game industry in 1983, but Atari had already set the foundations for the industry, for the good and the bad. So what's your point of view on this? For you, Atari or Nintendo, what is the most important for the history?
I have to say, I completely agree with you. Maybe I'm a little biased, but I can give you, I think, some very sound reasons why I think you're correct. I think, and I agree with you, it's not a question of better or worse because they were totally different things. Yeah. But right off the top of my head, the first thing I'd say Atari was more important. And Atari was more important for this reason. If you take Atari out, we don't know if there's a Sega and Nintendo later on.
Yeah.
Okay, because Atari was the first thing that really put video games out in the world, that really happened. There were game companies before Atari, but Atari was the transition that made it a phenomenon worldwide. If you take Atari out, we don't know if it ever goes anywhere like that. If you take Nintendo out, you still have Sega.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, because people always talk about there's Atari, and then they talk about Nintendo, Sega. It's always Nintendo and Sega. You always mention them together because they came together into the next generation.
Yeah.
But there was just Atari in the beginning, and that was the big launch. Atari changed the world that set the stage for the entire video game industry and so much more. One little known fact about what Atari really did has nothing to do with video games. It's actually about home computers, right? Because the truth is that at a time when in the late 70s, early 80s, people were trying to get home computers in homes. And most people were saying, why do I want a home computer? What am I going to do with a home computer? They had no idea. There was no killer app, right? And at the time when IBM was just getting to about 10,000 home computers sold, Atari was at 3 or 4 million VCSs sold. But those were computers, and there was basic programming. You could use your VCS like a computer because it was a computer. And then they actually did make a home computer that also did very well. But what Atari did more than anything else was put computers in people's homes and show them the value of entertainment that's there to have a computer in your home. And that transition changed everything. That changed the world in the way it is. Also, Atari really, truly made television interactive, right? Before video games, television was just something you sat and watched. And now Atari made it interactive. The way I like to put it is, before Atari, people were like zombies sitting on the couch watching their TV. Now with Atari, people are like zombies jumping up and down on their couch yelling at the TV. Right? It's now interactive. They're actually doing something with the TV as opposed to just receiving it, just watching. And when you change TV, you change the world, right? Yeah. And it was just huge. So the impact that Atari has had downstream on everything, the cultural transition of video games, I think Atari is the most important transition point. It's the biggest transition in that whole thing. There's Nintendo and there's Sega and there's Microsoft and there's Sony. There's a lot of important players along the way. But Atari was the transition from 0 to 1, which to me is always the biggest transition in the world.
Yeah, I agree. It's from nothing to something, and was something big, was a change of behavior, a change of culture. So yeah.
And the change was so big, that's what made the video game crash so devastating, is how could something become so big, so huge, be so pervasive all over the world, and then go away? It didn't make sense. It was absurd, but it happened, and we saw it.
Okay, and that was a perfect way to close the interview. We're back to the main topic of the conversation. I love the way that you frame it. Yeah. Can I do a final and quick question? Oh, sorry, you can go.
Okay, I just want to say I do have a very special piece of news.
Oh.
I mean, one piece of news that I have is that my Once Upon Atari book is an audio book. So people who want to listen to it can listen to it on Audible. And what people who read the book and listened to it have told me is that the audio book is a far better experience because I read the book. I'm the narrator. So if you get the audio book, you will hear me telling you my story. And people seem to really enjoy that. If you've enjoyed this interview, you will love the audio book. But the really big news, especially for your Brazilian listeners, is that if I may, can I share a screen?
Yes, of course.
I'd like to show for the first time. Here it is.
Wow.
This is
in Spanish.
I've got a Spanish translation. I'm sorry it's not Portuguese, but it's step by step.
But Spanish for us is much easier than English, so it's a big step here.
I would imagine. So I'm very, very honored to be able to present a Spanish version of this book. It means a lot to me to be able to reach a lot of my brothers in the Spanish world.
Yeah,
and sisters.
That's fantastic, Neil. I'm sure that you get like big penetration across all Latin America countries and of course Europe as well. And anytime if you think to launch a version in Portuguese, I can tell you Brazil video game like audience and market is big, is massive, and is still big. So you have a lot of space there, and people know you, people admire your work. So think about it as a next step.
I do, because when I think it was 2019, I was in Sao Paulo for the Brazil Game Show.
I know I have a lot of friends that got an autograph.
An autograph.
Yeah,
that was wonderful. I really enjoyed that. That was a great experience. I would be happy to do that again. That was a wonderful trip. So
you should, and let me know anything that I can help to make it happen. I have my connections there. It would be awesome to have you there again.
As many people know, I'm a psychotherapist now. I'm a practicing psychotherapist, and I have a client coming up in a few minutes. But you said you had one more question. I'd be happy to try and answer that for you.
Yeah, it's a very short one. So excluding Atari and the games that you develop, what for you is the best video game console ever and your favorite game?
Honestly, right now, I would say the best video game console is probably the PS5. I just think that's an amazing system that offers so many possibilities. Although the one thing it's not doing as well so far, but I expect it to move in that direction, is physical controller interface. I still like the Wii, and I like Quest systems. I like some VR systems for that kind of play. But PS5 is a very impressive console gaming system, and I very much like that. But I do have to say that best game, it's really hard to pick a best game, but I will tell you what I think is the single most important game in video game history. And that is Grand Theft Auto 3.
Wow. Yeah.
And I say that because I believe, just like Atari was the transition from no video games to video games, I think Grand Theft Auto was the transition from 2D to 3D gaming. And it was such an innovation in game design. There are things that were done in that game that were so far ahead of and so well conceived compared to any other game of that time. It really blew me away as a game designer. And although you can say it has a reprehensible theme, and maybe they should have done a nicer job theming it, the design, the way that game works with itself, the idea that you can be on one mission and learn things on that mission that help you in other missions, and that everything in the game, if you have a weapon that works in one way, it works that way all over the game, and you can use it. You know, some games say to do this, you have to have this particular weapon. You say, well, why can't I use the other one? It makes sense that they would all work. In this game, they all work. You know, when you want to do something, you can do it with a variety of different weapons or a variety of different techniques. And the idea that they made a cohesive world that you can use, you get knowledge in it, you use that knowledge in other parts of the game, that is really smart design in video games. Yeah. Because video games can always innovate technically. You can always make a faster system, you can always make graphics better. But to make a game better, to improve design, you can't always do that. You have to have people who are smart enough to do it and clever enough and creative enough to bring it into reality in a compact space. Yeah. And I think GTA 3 was one of the most impressive steps in that direction in the history of gaming that I've seen. So I just want to put that out there.
Thanks, and I love your pick because it came from an engineer standpoint. It was not only from a player standpoint, but I love the facts that you brought from an engineer standpoint. So that was great. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, I know we are on time, but thank you so much for your time. It was amazing for me. I will, if you allow me, I want to take a picture of us here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all right. Just to register this special moment. Thanks, Howard.
Luis, thank you so much.
All right, my friend. Bye-bye.
Take care.